Hi, welcome to Boarding Fundamentals Part 4, Boarding Residence Procedures. Boarding Fundamentals has 6 parts, and this part is Part 4, about the procedures in a boarding residence. Firstly, we're going to look at mission and vision, and we're going to note that boarding supervisors need a very clear job description that's current and accurate. They need comprehensive workplace policies and procedures and an effective induction program. When we look at vision and mission, the vision is the dreaming part, the goals, what we want for the future, where we're going, where we aim to travel. The mission part is what we're doing right now. That describes our activities, what we're doing right now. And so leaders understand that the vision and mission statements are critically important documents that provide direction and purpose for the organisation. And question 1 asks, what's the difference between a vision and mission statement? So I'm sure you can look at that and see what is the difference. And secondly, why are the vision and mission statements so important? The third part of this is, what is the difference between a policy and procedure? A policy is a statement about how the residence intends to conduct its actions. So they're like guiding principles to set a direction for the future and to help with decision making. Procedures are different because they're strategies for how each policy will be put into action. And they'll include things like the role of each person, the steps that they need to take, and any documenting or reporting procedures that are part of all of this. Question 2 asks, how do you access policies and procedures? Are they specific to boarding? Sometimes you have policies and procedures that are both a school and boarding policy and procedures. They need to be current and relevant, and there needs to be version control, which means that we need to know, are they current? Is this the latest version that's been produced? So now we want to look at routines. Routines help students feel safe. They help build self-control and good habits. They reduce power struggles with boarding supervisors. What we mean by that is that you can talk to a student about a routine and say, look, this is just the way we do it here. This is the routine. You need to do it like this. So it's not a personal thing between you and them. It's a routine and they need to do it. Routines develop self-reliance and mastery. Routines build resilience. And so this is question 3. Give 3 reasons why routines are so important in a boarding residence. So you've got 4 there, so choose 3 of those. Here's a typical routine. You've probably seen many of those before. Rosters. So this is, a lot of this is particularly useful for heads of boarding, but boarding supervisors should be aware of this as well. So rosters, effective rosters will result in a high standard of care. Why is that? It's because we've got the right people with the right skills, and we've got the right number of people for the number of students that we've got. So this is the answer to question 4. How can effective rosters provide a high standard of care? Plan the roster before adding names. The needs in the residence come first before a supervisor's particular needs. They might say, I need every weekend, and you might be saying, well, the residence has particular needs. Share roster options, pair people, match skills and strengths, etc. Handle availability and time off requests online if you can. Give sufficient time off. People need time to recuperate, to rebuild, and meet reasonable requests, staff obligations. You know, the whole idea here is to do what is most effective for the residents and the students, but at the same time to keep staff happy. There's lots of different roster types. You can have a regular weekly or fortnightly roster the same every time, or you might have a cycle which starts and ends at different times, or you might have a whole term roster. So there's all sorts of different ways of building rosters. Airlines have an approach where people bid for shifts, and so they earn credits or status from accepting unpopular shifts or unpopular routes, and then they can go on and bid for shifts in an open timetable. It's an interesting way of looking at rosters, and it's quite possible to do a boarding residence roster in the same way. The next section here looks at organisation, vertical or horizontal organisation. So vertical organisation is where you might have students from year 7 through to year 12 all in one house or grouped together. A horizontal organisation is where you have, say, all of the year 10s or all of the year 7s in one house. So you've got these two quite different ways of organising the boarding house, vertical or horizontal, bearing in mind that some boarding houses, some boarding residences are a combination of the two. A vertical model is more like a family, younger and older in together. The older can be positive role models, but bear in mind they can also be negative. It's a useful model for developing leadership where you can train younger students. It's different students can mix in boarding. So what we mean by that is you might have mixed with year 10 students all day, but when you go home to boarding, you can mix with younger students and older students, not the same students that you've been with all day. It's fairer for house spirit and competition. Routines can sometimes be difficult because in one house you're going to have different bedtimes, for example, because you've got younger and older children in there, so they will have different bedtimes, and there can be power imbalances. A horizontal model, better if older children are poor role models. Routines can be easier, such as bedtimes, and there is less power imbalance. And so question 5 asks, explain the 2 advantages of a horizontal and vertical organisational model of boarding. And so you've probably got some examples here of advantages of both. Just some considerations. Bullying occurs between peers, and so that means that bullying is more likely to occur between young people of the same age. Students who sexually abuse others tend to abuse younger students, and age difference equals a significant power imbalance. So all of these things we need to take into account when we're working out whether we have a vertical or horizontal structure. I think that the best way to work this out is to look at our student cohort. Are they self-reliant? Have we got older students who are very good role models? Then maybe we would opt for a vertical boarding structure or vertical boarding organisation. If our role models are not always good, if we've got students who are not used to boarding, who are not self-reliant, then maybe we would opt for more horizontal boarding structures. A lot of boarding houses do have that combination of the two. All right, the next part of this is tone and culture. And I first went out teaching in 1978, and we've been talking about tone and culture in schools and boarding ever since. It's just such an important part of what we do. So the tone is the feel or the atmosphere, the energy or the vibe. It's not something that is just a happy accident. It comes about by deliberate choices and actions of management and staff. It's developed over time, and it can be changed. So it can improve, it can be worse. So when we have a positive residence culture, we've got a safe and secure environment, free from bullying and harassment, a physical environment that's neat and clean and vibrant, deliberate development of good traditions, positive approach to behaviour management. And so they're all part of a positive residence culture. And question 6 asks, the tone of a residence is very important. What benefits would you expect for students from a positive, caring residence tone? So if the tone is positive, vibrant and caring, then you're going to have a happy living and working arrangement. Things will flow well. It's better for learning, for energy, warmth and high morale. If it's negative, and uncaring, you'll have that lack of warmth, low morale, and it's an unpleasant place to work. A positive culture supports and values staff members, trusts and believes in staff members, listens to their ideas and involves staff in decision making. Leadership spend time with staff and invest in staff training and professional development. So in developing a positive resident culture, you can organise events to develop a caring community, and a lot of boarding residences do this, get involved with their local community, and organise events where young people can give back to their own community. Time together, communal meals, positive conversations, and having an agreement that if you come with a problem, well, bring a solution as well, or even better, a couple of different ideas for a solution. Minimal complaining and negativity, high expectations for both students and staff. All of that is about developing a positive residence culture. It doesn't happen by accident. Okay, we want to look next at your employment agreement. You know, what sort of employment agreement do you have? And so question 7 says, what sort of agreement or award does your residence use or have that gives detail of your pay and conditions in boarding? And so this is likely to be a registered agreement or a national award, or a state award. So the national award is the Educational Services Schools General Staff Award 2010. It's part of the modern awards from the Fair Work Commission. You can have a registered agreement, which is an agreement between an employer and their employees regarding employment conditions. It's approved and registered with the Fair Work Commission. You should know what you've got, what award you're on, what are the conditions of that award. So all of these are registered agreements: Enterprise Collective, Greenfield Certified, Australian Workplace Agreements, and Individual Transitional Employment Agreements. All of those are registered agreements. Okay, so let's move on now to staff induction, and this is question 8. Why is it essential that the induction process for boarding staff is well planned and well managed? It needs to be comprehensive and effective because the role is very complex and the role is very serious. It's very complex because it involves so many different things, so many different parts, so many different actions during any one given day, during any one given week. It's serious because we're looking after other people's children. We've got responsibility for other people's children. So that's why it's so important that the induction has got to be right. And it's part of an organisation's duty of care. Part of their duty of care is to properly train and properly induct their staff. Induction. It sets a tone. It should be positive, enthusiastic. It should embrace the residence culture. It's an opportunity to learn the new employee's story, their experience, their strengths, and for them to meet everybody. And so when we're inducting a person, it's very important that, you know, we set this tone, you know, this positive, enthusiastic tone about what can be achieved here, the great opportunities there are in this organisation, etc. It's an opportunity to set that all with the new employee. Induction should be well planned and well managed. Ideally, the new person should shadow an experienced boarding supervisor, so they should not be responsible for the students maybe for a week or 2 weeks, but they should work with or shadow an experienced boarding supervisor. Induction should be tailored to the individual. It should be varied and interesting, not just reading through a whole lot of material. There should be a record of induction, and again, this is a part of you know, duty of care and evidence of duty of care. And so these days, institutions are asking that people sign off against parts of their induction. And there should be an induction feedback process so that people can feedback and say, my induction was good or lacked this or so on. There should be a feedback process. At induction, you would give policies and procedures, plans of the buildings and grounds, students, rules, rosters, etc., keys and codes, all the different staffs, students and lists, contact details, all that sort of thing you would give out at induction. Okay, so let's move on to 4.8, and this is staff appraisals. The benefits of an appraisal, staff appraisal, and staff appraisals for boarding supervisors should be annual, at least annual. Staff appraisals for heads of boarding or senior staff should probably be at least once every 2 years. So that's the industry standard. So the benefits of an appraisal, and this is question 9. What are 2 main reasons why staff appraisals are so important? It's time out for one-to-one with a head of boarding. And very often you don't get that. Boarding environments are so busy that you don't usually get that time out for one-to-one where you can just sit down with a head of boarding and talk with the head of boarding. It's a time when you can be motivated, where it's a time when you can be very satisfied to hear how well you've done. It's a time for training and development and for evaluation of, how you've travelled, how you've done your job. The process looks like this, that you establish standards, you communicate these standards, you measure the actual performance, then you compare actual performance with desired performance, and then you work out how you're going to fill those gaps, how you're going to train to meet those gaps. So in reality, what happens is, and here's this is a typical boarding supervisor self-assessment. So what would happen with this is that the boarding supervisor would get this, they would fill it in themselves, so they would do a self-appraisal, and then the head of boarding would sit down with them, they'd talk to them about it and work through how the head of boarding saw each of these elements, and then how the supervisor saw each of these elements, and if there's any difference between the perception. So there's a bit more of that appraisal. So let's talk about now performance management. Performance management is quite different to an appraisal. Performance management is a process where the supervisor's performance is being intentionally managed. And this is because they're a new employee, it's a change role, but nearly always it's because there's been unsatisfactory performance or because something's happened, people are unhappy, and so the organisation or the head of boarding wants to performance manage a staff member. So how does it work? First of all, you set goals for performance, and then you monitor performance against those goals. And those goals are nearly always time-oriented, so you will need to do a certain thing by a certain time, and if you haven't done it, then they will want to know why. If we look at underperformance is not carrying out work to the required standard, it's not doing the job at all, it's not following workplace policies and procedures, it's unacceptable behaviour like telling inappropriate jokes, it's disruptive or negative behaviour, negative talk about the organisation or the company. Serious misconduct, this is question 11. Serious misconduct is serious imminent risk to health and safety. It's risk to the reputation or the profits of the business. And all of this comes from Fair Work Australia, from the Ombudsman. I haven't made it up. Or it's when an employee deliberately behaves in a way that's inconsistent with continuing their employment. So that's question 11. And then it asks for 3 examples. And there's some examples here. Refusing to carry out work duties, theft, assault, being drunk at work, fraud, that sort of thing is serious misconduct. So let's move on now to student induction. So student induction, these are the sort of things that you would expect to see in student induction, welcoming students, motivating and inspiring students. All of these things here are part of induction. And this might go on for a couple of days. You might have induction for a couple of days. Some organisations have induction away from the school at a campsite. So they have an induction camp. There's lots of different ways of carrying out this induction. I'll just say this one thing. This is a chance to enthuse, to excite your students about being in your residence, about being in your boarding school, just making them very excited about being here, getting them to see the possibilities and the potential for being in this wonderful boarding environment. Here's another part of this. You might do tours of local town, talk about student representatives, and all of this sort of thing here is part of student induction. Question 12 is a scenario, and it asks you to do a student induction speech. It's a welcome speech. And what we are really hoping to see in this is a very positive, enthusiastic welcome to the students and talking to them about how exciting it is to be here, the wonderful facilities, the wonderful opportunities, all these lovely people who you can associate with. A very positive talk to the students at this student induction. So that's what we're wanting here for this scenario. Question 12, this scenario. Ideally, we would like this in audio form. So best case scenario for us is that we see some dot points down here, and then we have this in audio form. And some people who have sent these in audio form have sent in some fantastic induction speeches, and it's just great to see those. It would be great to be a student listening to that. All right, this next section is about facilitating acceptable behaviour. How do we get acceptable behaviour? So there's been some research done, and it says the likelihood of a student complying to a request relies on this. The politeness of the request. Is the request legitimate? Is the closeness of the relationship, and credibility and authority. So legitimacy of the request. Should you even be asking this student to do this? Is the relationship close? Like, do you have a good professional relationship with this student, or do you hardly ever talk to them and hardly know them? And do you have credibility and authority? So credibility has three elements. Competency, that you're smart and you're in touch, that you're trustworthy, and that you're caring. Unacceptable behaviour are things that are more serious than just being annoying. They're harmful or disrespectful, or they break the rules. The supervisor must intervene. The supervisor must request that the behaviour cease. When we respond to unacceptable behaviour, we remain calm and polite. We remind, warn and act. Talk quietly, avoid shaming or embarrassing students, use restorative process, and apply natural consequences if consequences are required. So rules of compliance. Rule 1 is that requests are fair and reasonable and polite. Rule 2, and we've covered that a little bit already. Rule 2 is that we expect students to comply. So when we ask them to do something, you just have that expectation there. I've asked you to do this, therefore I expect you to do it. Rule 3 is you do not accept non-compliance. Under no circumstances do you accept non-compliance. So if you have got a student who is very upset and very worked up and is not complying, well, you may not try and force the issue there and then. You might step back from that issue, allow time for people to calm down, and then you might talk to the student again. But you don't just leave it be. You don't ever just accept non-compliance, because once you've done that, you lose any kind of authority in the boarding house. Rule 4 is to remind, warn and act. Rule 5 is to make sure your battles are worth fighting. Don't take on a student about an issue if this is a very minor issue and it's just not worth really worrying about. Whatever you threaten, you must carry out. So just be very careful about what you threaten. And a lot of times boarding staff will say things like, if you keep doing this, then I'm going to have to suspend you, or you're going to be kicked out. When really, they don't have that authority. They don't make the decision about who's going to leave or be suspended from the organisation. So make sure that you're only saying things which you can actually carry out. And it's very important to be consistent so that everybody around the organisation is saying and doing the same things. So then we come to scenario, this scenario here, which is, it's moving forward a little, but it's scenario 21, question 21, it's scenario 2, and this is about behaviour. So basically, it's this scenario about Joanna, and we're asking you to talk to Joanna and to outline how exactly you would talk to her, what you would say to Joanna. And the instructions are there. I think one of the important things is that this is not a little rant at Joanna. You know, you've done the wrong thing. It's a time when we talk to her about how she's feeling, why has she done this, how can she fix this up, how has this made people feel, etc. All right, so you do that much the same as you did the last scenario. We'd love people to do that, to send us an audible recording of that. All right, so the next section here is about responding to suicide, risk and self-harm. So it's a fairly serious section. There's many reasons why people engage in self-harm. They often do this as a way of coping with difficult emotion or tough experience or damaging relationships that they're trying to cope with. It's not just attention seeking. It is letting others know that they're not coping, and it doesn't necessarily lead to suicide. It can just be an indicator of being at risk of suicide. So if this is very personal for you, if it's upsetting for you, then feel free to move forward in these slides. Suicide can occur without warning. More often there are some sort of cues or clues. Often the person will have a history of personal problems and there'll be warning signs, mental health issues, previous threats of suicide, previous suicide attempts. So how would you actually know that a person is at risk of suicide? You'd know because the student has commented to you or to another student, or because you've seen indicators. And indicators are these sort of indicators: pulling away from friends, suddenly in trouble at school or boarding, talking about death or suicide or saying they want to hurt themselves, having trouble concentrating, changing sleep or eating habits, giving away belongings, sudden change in behaviour, especially calmness after a period of anxiety, losing interest in activities, self-destructive behaviour like heavy drinking of alcohol, talking about feeling hopeless or guilty. So they are the sort of things that are indicators. And that one there, the sudden change in behaviour, especially calmness after a period of anxiety, that is a strong indicator. Why do people take their own lives? They're in great emotional pain. They've lost hope. They have that terrible trauma inside themselves. They've lost hope that anything can ever change. They don't actually want to die, but death seems like the only way to escape. They feel worthless, undeserving. They feel isolated. They desperately want help, but too scared to talk to anyone. So they're the sort of reasons why people take their own lives. So how do we respond? We must always take any indicators of self-harm or suicide very seriously. Even if a young person is threatening suicide or self-harm because they can't get the things that they want, you've told them they can't go down the street or they can't go to the movies tonight, and they might say something, well, I'll just go and get a rope then. You need to take that very seriously every single time. And we need to recognise that confidentiality is less important than seeking help. We need to seek help at times like this. So we want to look at two scenarios here. The first is if the student appears depressed, and then the second is if the student is a possible suicide risk. So in this first one, they're not actually what we would consider a suicide risk. They're just down or depressed or not themselves. So we observe carefully, we make sure the student's not left alone, we listen carefully to what the student's saying and access support. We monitor the student. And if the student remains down or depressed or gets worse or shows any sign of suicide risk indicators, then we proceed immediately to regard them as a suicide risk. Now, if they are a suicide risk, we can ask them very directly, are you thinking about taking your own life? So you can ask them very directly. And in mental health first aid, for example, that's what they suggest you do. And so people might think, if I ask them directly, am I actually putting this in their minds? Am I suggesting that they should be doing this? And the answer is no. We need to find out, are they thinking about doing this? You need to be careful the way you do that. You don't say, you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? Because then they're just going to say no. We need to ask them very directly, are you thinking about taking your own life? If they give some indication that they are thinking about suicide, then we advise the boarding managers and others that need to do no. We get professional assistance immediately. And in nearly every case, that means getting the student to the mental health ward at the local hospital as fast as possible. We need the help of health professionals, mental health professionals immediately. Not in 2 days' time, we need it immediately. If there is suicide risk, we need that help immediately. When the student comes back to us, we need to continue support. There needs to be effective long-term support. And we should have in place a risk assessment and a safety plan for the young person. So the next section we're going to look at is looking at the needs, rights and responsibilities of young people. And so Manfred Max Neef looked at human needs and said they're interrelated and interactive, as indeed they are. So he looked at needs in terms of all of those on the right-hand side there. We're probably more familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs when he looked at the physiological needs, our food, air, water, all those sort of things we need to survive, safety, love, belonging, esteem, right up to the top to self-actualization. And what he was saying was that you can't move to the next level until you've actually had the level below, the needs from the level below met. In the boarding house, lots of needs are interrelated. The needs and rights are interrelated. For example, students need to take some sort of risks and learn from their mistakes, but parents have got the right for a safe environment for their young people. And supervisors need to provide safety for students. And supervisors have also got needs here as well. So supervisors need to have an environment where their safety is recognised and where they can provide a safe environment for young people. So supervisors have got needs here as well. So all of these can be quite interrelated, the needs and rights here. And so this question asks you, question 15, give an example of how needs and rights might be interrelated in the boarding residence. Students' rights are protected by law, legislation, codes of ethics, or our agreements with parents and guardians. So that comes out of our policies and procedures. That students' rights are protected by these documents here: enrolment, advertising, promotional material, parent handbook, etc. And they call those implied rights because they're implied from the documents that you've provided to the parents. So these are the sort of things that are students' rights, a safe boarding environment, privacy, confidentiality, to be treated with respect and dignity, to have their social, cultural and physical needs met, to have informed choice, to be able to make a complaint if they want, and to be informed about the service, policies and procedures, expectations and rules. Parents must be aware of the aims, codes of conduct and rules of the residence and informed of change. And changes should be really signed off by parents. Supervisors have got a right to a lot of things, and I've just got some of them here, but a safe working environment, privacy, access to information held about them, confidentiality, treated with respect and dignity, informed choice, a pay packet is part of their right as well. So they're all the rights of supervisors. So let's look at this next section, identifying student needs. And as you go through the rest of this Certificate 4, this is a bit of a theme through here. So how do we identify students' needs? How do we meet their needs? So you can identify their needs from documents like their application form, any special needs profiles, and often application forms will have health forms attached to them, just by observing students, being informed by students, being informed by others, feedbacks, complaints. There's lots of ways of identifying students' needs. We can collect and analyse information by either informal or formal processes. We need to make sure this is within the limits of our role. We're not psychologists or psychiatrists, doctors. We don't diagnose, and it also should be in line with the policies and procedures of the organisation. When we're collaborating with the student and the family to meet needs, we need to research what will best meet their needs, discuss the options, assist and negotiate young people with working through these options, and identify any barriers or resources that we can use in meeting their needs, and then contacting or referring to the most appropriate individuals or organisations. So in addressing students' needs, we address students' needs by supporting young people ourselves or providing other services from within the residence. So that might be, so for example, if you're supporting a young person who's homesick, you might just be encouraging them and being positive around them. If you're supporting a young person who's got a health need, you might take the young person to your residence nurse. If you're supporting a young person who has got some more serious issue, if they're depressed, for example, you might refer to a professional outside your organisation. If you're not able to meet the student's needs, like if it's outside the experience, skills or knowledge of staff, or if it's not met by the program or not catered for in the program or not catered for by the procedures, there are alternatives. And this might be to retrain or employ additional staff, bring in external personnel, refer to outside people who are professionals, redesign the program, adjust procedures, change the environment, or work with the student so that they can move to a more suitable residence. All right, so let's look at student support. All students should feel comfortable to approach with a need or issue at least one member of staff and a known advocate, a person outside the residence. So that would probably be somebody in the school. Supervisors should recognise when they're not qualified or they're not able to recognise or to assist a student who's got an issue or a need. So let's talk about motivating for a moment. Different things motivate different students. The important thing is to have a good professional relationship. That's essential to understanding what will motivate. The two types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic is motivation from within, when you're self-motivated. So my son has a very strong exercise program, and he doesn't do that for reward. He doesn't do it for any extrinsic reason. He does it because he's motivated from within to run each morning, to go to the gym, to participate in CrossFit, all of those sort of things. It comes from within. Extrinsic motivation is from outside. It's like a reward or a gift, that sort of thing. When we're motivating students, if you're going to give them a reward, they will reward for this will work for basic tasks, but it doesn't really work for changing long-term behaviour. There are more intrinsic motivators like challenge, when a young person is doing something that's a challenge, mastering an activity, or making a contribution to society or to another person. If we look at encouraging, encouraging is giving support, confidence or hope, and we should take every opportunity to encourage students in our care. We should show genuine interest in what's important to them, take time with them, do unexpected things, unexpected nice things for them, acknowledge their feelings, say well done, congratulations, thank you, and return the favour. If they do a favour to us, return the favour to them. Okay, let's look at advocacy. Advocacy is where we publicly support a case on somebody else's behalf. So this differs from mediation or negotiation. So in mediation or negotiation, we're trying to reach a mutually acceptable outcome, but the role of the advocate in advocacy is not impartial. It's not about reaching something that's mutual. It's about what is best for the young person that we're advocating for. Self-advocacy is the ability of a young person to speak for themselves, to say what they think or feel, to speak up for what they believe in, to know their rights, to take responsibility for their own life and make decisions that affect and improve their life. The self-advocacy, this ability of students to speak for themselves, is important because it enables students to be empowered, to be self-reliant, and to be self-determining. How do we support self-advocacy? We should empower the student, and this should be our first option before we advocate for them. So enabling them to do this for themselves. So just to help them understand their rights, identify possible barriers, provide information, work out strategies with them, ensure confidentiality, talk to them about the results. So give them the tools to self-advocate. Talk to them about what you would say, the right sort of things to say, the right manner in which to self-advocate. So let's have a look at student leave procedures. This is a part of the procedures for all boarding residences, really. It's important because we must know where students are. There's really two ways of doing this. You can do it with a digital system, an online system such as Reach, Boardingware or Onboard, or you can do a manual sign out, sign in process. Some people use magnets on a board, some organisations. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. There's two different types of leave. There's short-term leave, which might be going down to the shops or might be going out for the afternoon or going to the gym or whatever. And there's overnight leave, or that might be, for the whole weekend. And the leave process is pretty straightforward. The student requests leave, the hosts agree, so the person where they're going agree. Head of boarding contacts the parents to request permission. Head of boarding makes sure the student doesn't have sanctions, such as grounding or any other commitments. Head of boarding approves leave, student signs out when they're leaving, student signs in when they're returning. I should point out that in most cases, leave to a particular host is pre-approved. So when the student applies to come to the organisation, nearly always the leave is pre-approved. So with their application, they might have 2 or 3 or 5 different people that they can go out to. And these are, this information is updated as the student remains in boarding. Students should realise that leave is not an automatic right. Leave may not be granted if the student has commitments or they're grounded or the host is not approved by parents or the residence knows that where they're going is unsafe. It might be there might be a party there where there's alcohol or drugs or whatever. So leave may not be granted under those circumstances. Okay, so let's have a look at managing digital devices. This has become quite an issue in boarding. How do we manage phones, smartphones, tablets, iPads, computers, and basically there's a few ways of doing it. Some organisations allow students to have their phones at night time and they have a responsible use agreement. They keep students accountable, they monitor the usage. Other organisations collect all phones at bedtime and they give them back after breakfast. Sometimes some organisations don't give them back until the students arrive home the next day after school, so they don't have them at school either. And some organisations have a mix of these where they allow students to have their phones overnight and juniors hand their phones in at night. You can search or confiscate a student's phone. So if you have reasonable grounds that the phone contains evidence of a breach of school policy or law, then you can take it off the student. And there should be a specific statement or policy in your policies and procedures which state that. So you can remove a student's phone or other device. It should be consistent with your policies and procedures. Should have the support of head of boarding for your actions, and there should be reasonable grounds. It may involve the breach of child protection laws, and if that's the case, then you need to be quite careful. So you would involve another supervisor to put it in a secure place, keep it in view of the student until the police arrive, and then advise and report to the appropriate department or the state mandatory reporting person. Okay, moving on to searches and confiscations of property. What can be confiscated? How long can it be confiscated? Is it returned to the student or is it returned to the parents? So the main thing is that the parents need to be made aware of the policy and should agree to the policy, usually before they actually enrol the student in the enrolment procedure. So for different items, there's different approaches. For mobile phones, they're returned to students. For things like tobacco products or alcohol, they're given to the parents or disposed of. For things that are illegal, such as weapons or illegal substances, such as illegal drugs, then they would usually be passed on to the police. Digital device content, so phone content, staff do not have the right to open and inspect the contents of mobile phones. So previously we talked about the fact that staff could take a mobile phone from a student, so that you could remove a phone from a student, but you do not have the right to open and go through the phone, the contents of the student's mobile phone. It's a matter for parents or police. And the other thing we need to remember that is that we are liable for property once it's been confiscated. And if you think about the value of an Apple iPhone these days, an Apple iPhone 8 or an Apple iPhone 10 is probably worth close to $1,000. If a phone goes missing, well, you're actually liable for it. So we just need to be very careful about how we deal with students' property, particularly things like phones. You can ask for a student to hand over an item, but you can't take an item by force from the student. And so you might be thinking, well, what do I do? You know, if I ask the student to hand me their phone, they haven't handed the phone over to me, they've just disobeyed that request. Well, you treat that in exactly the same way that you would treat any other blatant disobedience infringement. So if a student disobeys your request, then you treat it exactly the same way. Does this involve passing the student onto the head of boarding? Does it involve consequences? What does it involve? You treat it exactly the same way. So searches of a student's property, this is question 26. Student can be asked to empty the content of their bag or pockets. If they refuse, then same as before, they come under the school discipline policy. What they've actually done is that they've refused to obey a request, or they have refused to follow a request. So we treat it in that way. Searches of a student's property, we involve the parents or police to carry out a search, keep the student isolated but in full view of their property. So if we're concerned about the contents of a mobile phone, and we've got good reason to be concerned about it, then we keep the student isolated but in view of the phone, and we can then involve people like the parents or police if we're going to do that. And If you're going to involve the police, you need to be fairly sure that that's the right thing to do. You'd really need to involve your head of boarding before you do that. If you think about how this works, if it is school property, so if it's the school desk or it's the school locker, for example, then it can be searched without permission. Generally best to have the student there, but it can be searched. If it is a student's property, so it's their own phone or it's their own bag or something that belongs to them, then it can't be searched without permission. So that's that clear delineation. If it belongs to the school or the residence, it can be searched. If it doesn't belong to the school or residence, then it can't be searched. When you're talking about searching students themselves, they're doing a body search or something like that, this should not occur unless the student is in danger of harming themselves or others. So this cannot occur unless the student is in danger of harming themselves, doing some sort of injury to themselves or some sort of injury to another person because of what they're holding. So it's the only way you can do searches of students is under very extreme situations, and generally you would involve the head of boarding or the police or the parents to search the student. So I hope that's clear about searching phones, searching property, what you can confiscate, what you can look at as far as student phones and property is concerned. So let's look now at volunteers. Volunteers can clearly enrich the boarding experience. They can expose the students to different cultures and lifestyles. Often they're very young, enthusiastic, they've got lots of energy, they can be great role models. They can be a very significant contribution. Support for busy supervisors, they can assist students with homework, they can prepare activities and equipment, they can wait with 6 students, they can help with sports, outings, all that sort of thing. But we just need to be aware of these things. They are not supervisors, so they can't do what supervisors do. They don't have that responsibility for students that supervisors have. The number of volunteers in a residence is important. So if you've got a small number of volunteers, they can be very good, very useful. When you've got a very large number of volunteers, they will then take quite a bit to manage, and the effort to manage this number of volunteers is probably greater than the value that they bring to boarding. So you need to work out that balance between the number of volunteers and what they can bring to boarding, and the number of volunteers and what they take to manage and what they take away from boarding. They should have the same working with children and police clearance as the rest of the staff, and boarding providers are responsible for workplace health and safety of volunteers exactly the same as they are with the rest of the staff. There should be a very clear code of conduct for volunteers. If volunteer age is close to boarder's age, then keep the boundaries firm, and there's lots of examples of where this has come unstuck. Have a very good induction for volunteers, very clear policies and procedures, and if language is if it's a issue for volunteers, then work out how you're going to get around that, how you're going to deal with the language issues. So volunteers are great, they're fantastic, they're a really good resource, but we need to be careful how we manage volunteers. Okay, let's have a look at the complaints procedures. So complaints occur because of poor communication, ideas and perspectives are not sought, periods of change, expectations are not met with facilities, meals, etc., etc. So how do we manage them? It's very important that we have a correct initial response. Never accept or deny blame. So don't say, oh, I'm very sorry, I know Tom, he always does this. We never say that because we don't know the circumstances. We need to look into the circumstances first. So never accept or deny blame. never respond in anger or self-defense, so never get angry with the person, and just try and respond professionally and empathetically. So the very first part of this is to listen with empathy, stay calm. And you may say to them, look, I understand how you feel. If that happened to my student, I would feel angry. So respond with empathy. Follow the correct procedure, pass it to the correct person, so that may be the head of boarding. Keep all of this information confidential. Inform the person, if it's a parent, whoever, of the progress. Explain to them how they can seek further action if they're not satisfied with the way this is handled, and maintain a log of complaints. Show the resolution and the outcome of all these complaints. So that's complaints from parents or from other people to the organisation, but we may also get student complaints. So an effective written student complaints process is part of our duty of care. It means that complaints can't be overlooked. It means this whole process empowers the student. It provides a record that the complaint has been dealt with, and it's a part of our boarding standards. And although the standards aren't mandated today at this time, they will be in time, and it will be part of the boarding standards. So the student complaints process should be explained during student induction. It should be available in the student handbook. It should be in the admin office. And so students should be well and truly aware of how the whole complaints process works. It's a part of empowering young people. Okay, so let's look now at reviewing our effectiveness as an organisation, as a boarding organisation, how we have dealt with these boarders, our boarding programs. So this is a review of services and feedback from students, parents, school staff, boarding and resident staff. So this may be a survey, a student satisfaction tracking questionnaire, and if you'd like one of those, please contact us. A complaint form, we also have those. Anecdotal evidence such as student or parent complaints, comments, emails, that sort of thing. You could also do a written questionnaire, an interview such as a structured or unstructured interview, or you could do a survey chimp type mobile optimized survey. But one way or the other, it's important that we do get some information back about our boarding procedures. Have they worked? How effective have they been for the young people? And so that's the end of this unit. Thank you very much. Bye.